He crashed the market. By design. He sowed absolute panic, bankrupting thousands of people in a single hour. And then, he bought up the entire British economy for pennies on the pound. All in one day. How did a single trick, aided by a simple carrier pigeon, transform a family of outsiders into the invisible masters of the world? This is the story of the greatest heist in financial history, a maneuver so audacious it isn't taught in economics textbooks. This is the truth about the Rothschilds. London, June 1815. Fear hangs in the air. In the center of the Royal Exchange, leaning against his favorite pillar, stands Nathan Rothschild. He is pale, grim, and speaks not a word. The entire financial elite has eyes only for him. They know, if Rothschild buys, England has won. If he sells, Napoleon has won, and the empire is doomed. Nathan slowly raises his hand and signals his agents. Sell. The hall explodes into panic. The stocks of the world's greatest power plunge into the abyss. Men lose fortunes in seconds, convinced the war is lost. But there is one thing they do not know. Rothschild isn't saving his money. Right now, in plain sight, he is committing the most brilliant heist in human history. To understand how one family could possibly capture the wealth of an empire in a single afternoon, we cannot start at the finish line. We have to go back to the mud, the squalor, and the ambition where it all began. The year is 1744. We are in Frankfurt, Germany, but not the glittering financial hub you see today. We are in the Judengasse, the Jewish lane. It is a narrow, dark, muddy street, less than a quarter of a mile long, squeezed between the city walls and a ditch. At night, the gates to this street were locked and chained. On Sundays and holidays, the residents were not allowed to leave. It was here, in a house marked with a red shield, or in German, Rothschild, that Mayer Rothschild was born. He had no title. He had no land. He had no rights. By all accounts, he should have lived and died in obscurity. But Mayer possessed something far more valuable than gold. He understood human psychology. He started as a dealer in rare coins and antiques. It seems like a small trade, but it was a strategic masterstroke. Why? Because rare coins allowed him to enter the drawing rooms of the aristocracy. He knew that princes and dukes were obsessed with prestige. If he could sell them history, he could gain their trust. He targeted one man specifically, Prince William of Hesse-Kassel, one of the richest men in Europe. William made his fortune in a grim business, renting out his own soldiers as mercenaries to foreign wars. He had mountains of cash, but he needed someone discreet to manage it. Mayer made himself indispensable. He became the Court Jew, a title that granted him protection and access. But Mayer looked at the prince's pile of gold and realized something profound. Money sitting in a vault is useless. Money moving across borders, lending to kings, financing armies, that is power. However, Mayer knew he was mortal. He knew that building a dynasty required more than one brilliant mind. It required a network. And so, as he lay on his deathbed in 1812, he didn't just leave his 5 sons a fortune. He left them a mission. He gathered them around and gave them a set of strict, almost cult-like instructions that would change the world. He told them, "Stay together. Work together. If you divide your capital, you will fall. If you combine it, you will rule." And then he did the unthinkable. He didn't keep them in Frankfurt. He weaponized them. He deployed his 5 sons like generals to the 5 financial capitals of Europe. Amschel stayed in Frankfurt. Solomon went to Vienna. Karl went to Naples. James went to Paris. And the most ambitious, the most brilliant, and the most ruthless of them all, Nathan, was sent to the heart of the beast, London. The trap was set. The spiderweb was spun across Europe, but the world didn't know it yet. They were about to learn, because the Napoleonic Wars were brewing, and the Rothschilds were the only ones ready to profit from the bloodshed. With the brothers positioned in London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples, the Rothschilds created something that had never existed before. To the outside world, they looked like 5 separate banks. In reality, they were a single, pulsating organism. Imagine the year 1814. If a British merchant wanted to do business in Paris, he faced a nightmare. He had to transport heavy chests of gold across the English Channel, risking storms, pirates, and, worst of all, warships. Europe was tearing itself apart. Borders were closed. Transport was slow. The Rothschilds bypassed the world. They developed their own private communication network. They hired the fastest couriers, men who rode horses into the ground to shave hours off a delivery time. They chartered their own boats that would sail in weather that kept the Royal Navy in port. While the rest of the world operated on a delay of weeks, the Rothschilds operated on a delay of days. If Nathan in London needed to send money to James in Paris, he didn't ship gold. He simply wrote a letter. James would receive the instruction and pay out the funds from his own vault. They invented a system of internal clearing that made them the only people in Europe capable of moving massive amounts of wealth across enemy lines instantly. They had effectively built the 19th century equivalent of the internet. And in a time of war, information is not just power, it is ammunition. This unique advantage brought Nathan Rothschild to the attention of the British government. The year was 1814, and the Duke of Wellington was fighting Napoleon's forces in France. But Wellington had a catastrophic problem. He had the men, he had the guns, but he had no money. His soldiers were starving and unpaid. The British government had plenty of gold sitting in London, but they had absolutely no way to get it to Wellington without it being seized by the French. Desperate, the British turned to Nathan. Nathan didn't just agree to help, he executed one of the most daring smuggling operations in the history. He used his brother in Paris, right under the nose of Napoleon's police, to convert British bills into French gold coins. They disguised the shipments, bribed officials, and utilized their network of smugglers to funnel a river of gold through France itself, straight into Wellington's pockets. It was a masterstroke. The Rothschilds were now financing the war against Napoleon, profiting from every single transaction. They had become the bankers of the British Empire. But by 1815, the game changed. Napoleon, who had been exiled, escaped. He returned to Paris, raised a new army, and marched toward Belgium. The 100 Days had begun. The entire fate of Europe and the Rothschild fortune now rested on a single upcoming battle. The financial markets in London were paralyzed with fear. Everyone held their breath. The instrument of choice for gamblers and investors was the Consul, the British government bond. Here is why this matters. The Consul was a bet on the future of Britain. If Wellington defeated Napoleon, the British Empire would be secure, and the value of these bonds would skyrocket. But if Napoleon won, the empire would crumble, the debt would be worthless, and the consuls would collapse to zero. Every banker, every lord, every merchant in London knew the stakes. They knew that the first man to hear the news from the battlefield would make a fortune. If you knew the outcome before the rest of the market, you could essentially print money. The Rothschilds prepared for this moment like a military operation. Nathan had his agents stationed at the port of Ostend in Belgium. He had a chain of fresh horses waiting along the road, and, according to the famous legend, He had a secret weapon that no government could stop: the homing pigeons. The story goes that while the English Channel was locked down by a massive hurricane and no ship dared to leave the port, a Rothschild agent released a single bird into the gray sky, a blue homing pigeon carrying a tiny canister on its leg with a coded message. While the British fleet was paralyzed by the storm, this bird flew over the weather, crossing the sea in silence and landing directly at Nathan's window in London. Whether it was truly a bird or a daredevil boat captain, the result was the same. The stage was set. The armies converged on a muddy field near a town called Waterloo. The cannons began to roar. And back in London, Nathan Rothschild stood by his pillar at the stock exchange, holding a secret that was worth more than the crown itself. Sunday, June 18, 1815. On a sodden field in Belgium, the world was ending. The Battle of Waterloo was not just a military engagement, it was a slaughterhouse. For hours, the French cavalry charged the British squares. The noise was deafening. The roar of cannons, the screams of dying horses, the clash of steel. By late afternoon, the outcome was still uncertain. The fog of war was literal. Smoke covered the valley, making it impossible to see who was winning. But amidst the smoke, a man was watching. He wasn't a soldier. He was a Rothschild agent. As soon as he saw the French lines break and Napoleon's Imperial Guard retreat, he didn't stay to celebrate. He turned his horse and galloped away. He rode through the night to the Belgian coast, to the port of Ostend. There, a fierce storm was raging. The English Channel was a churning wall of gray water. No captain was willing to sail. It was a suicide mission. But the agent offered a local fisherman a fortune, enough gold to buy a new boat and retire, if he would take him across immediately. Greed outweighed fear. They set sail into the tempest. While the British government's official envoy was still asleep in Brussels, the Rothschild boat was battling the waves, carrying the most valuable piece of information in the world. Early on the morning of June 20th, Nathan Rothschild received the damp, sealed dispatch. He opened it. He read 3 words: Napoleon is beaten. He was now 24 hours ahead of the British government. He was 24 hours ahead of the newspapers. He possessed the crystal ball that every investor dreams of. Logic dictates that Nathan should have immediately rushed to the stock exchange and bought every British bond he could get his hands on. The news of victory would send prices soaring. It was the obvious play. It was the safe play. But Nathan Rothschild didn't want a quick profit. He wanted it all. He walked into the London Stock Exchange. The room fell silent. All eyes fixed on him. They knew his network was faster than the king's. If Nathan looked happy, England had won. If he looked grim, England had lost. Nathan walked to his usual spot against a pillar. He didn't smile. He looked despondent. He looked like a man who had just lost his entire fortune. Slumping his shoulders, he caught the eye of his brokers, and he began to sell. He dumped British consols onto the market, thousands of them. A whisper tore through the room like wildfire. Rothschild is selling. Then it became a shout. Napoleon has won! All is lost! Panic is a contagious disease, and in that crowded room, it was lethal. The herd mentality took over. Dukes, merchants, and seasoned bankers began screaming to sell their bonds at any price. They were terrified that by tomorrow, those papers would be worthless certificates of a fallen empire. The price of consols crashed. They fell 5%. 10%. They kept falling. The floor of the exchange was awash with paper as men desperately tried to salvage pennies from their fortunes. The entire credit rating of the British Empire was collapsing in real time. Nathan stood by his pillar, emotionless, watching the chaos he had engineered. He waited until the desperation was absolute. He waited until the bonds were selling for mere fractions of their true value, practically garbage. And then, just moments before the market closed, with a subtle flick of his finger, the strategy shifted. His shadow agents, men who no one knew worked for him, stepped out of the crowd. While everyone else was selling, these men began to buy. They bought everything. They scooped up the entire debt of the British Empire for the price of scrap paper. That night, the official government messenger finally arrived in London with the news. Wellington had won. Napoleon was finished. The next morning, the markets opened, and the truth came out. The price of consols didn't just recover, they exploded upwards, gaining value faster than at any point in history. The same people who had sold their bonds in a panic the day before now watched in horror as the value of those assets multiplied in the hands of one man. In a single day of trading, Nathan Rothschild had increased his family's wealth by a factor of 20. He hadn't just made a killing, he had effectively bought the mortgage of the British Empire. From that day forward, the government didn't just owe him money, they owed him their existence. The dust of Waterloo settled, but the world that emerged from the smoke was different. The era of military conquest was fading. The era of financial conquest had begun. And sitting on the throne of this new world was not a monarch, but a banker. Nathan Rothschild famously said, "I care not what puppet is placed upon the throne of England to rule the empire on which the sun never sets. The man who controls Britain's money supply controls the British Empire, and I control the British money supply." This wasn't arrogance. It was a statement of fact. In the decades that followed, the five brothers transformed from mere lenders into the engine of the Industrial Revolution. They didn't just hoard gold, they put it to work on a scale previously unimaginable. When Europe needed railways to connect its cities, the Rothschilds wrote the checks. When the British government needed to buy the Suez Canal to secure the route to India, they didn't go to Parliament for a debate. That would take too long. The Prime Minister simply had dinner with a Rothschild, and by dessert, the money was on the table. They became the stabilizing force of the 19th century. In fact, historians often refer to this period not just as the Pax Britannica, the British peace, but as the Pax Rothschild. Why? Because they had grown so powerful that they could single-handedly stop wars. If a king wanted to invade a neighbor, he first had to ask the Rothschilds for a loan to buy cannons and feed soldiers. If the brothers decided the war was bad for business, they simply closed the checkbook. The war was cancelled before the first shot was fired. They had effectively privatized the role of a central bank. They were the Federal Reserve, the IMF, and the World Bank, all rolled into one family. But this immense power birthed a shadow. It was during this golden age that the myths began to fester. People looked at this Jewish family, operating across borders, speaking different languages, controlling the fate of nations from behind velvet curtains, and they felt a deep, primal unease. The conspiracy theories we hear today, that they control the weather, that they secretly own every central bank, that they possess a net worth of $500 trillion, are the echoes of that 19th century fear. But here is the twist that most conspiracy theorists miss. The Rothschild Empire didn't collapse, it diluted. Meyer Amschel had left strict instructions. The business belongs to the family. But he couldn't stop time. As the generations passed, the five sons had dozens of children, and those children had dozens more. The colossal fortune that was once concentrated in 5 hands was divided among hundreds of heirs. Simultaneously, the world caught up. The very system of global banking they invented was copied by others, New titans like J.P. Morgan and the Rockefellers rose in America, eclipsing the old European powers. Corporate structures replaced family dynasties. Today, the Rothschilds are still wealthy, yes. They still own banks, vineyards, and vast estates. But they no longer own the world. They simply own a seat at the table they built. But if this family was so powerful, why don't we see Rothschild Tower in every city alongside Trump Tower or Rockefeller Center? How did they go from owning the British Empire to being a shadow? The answer is the one thing money cannot buy: peace. The 20th century was a meat grinder for the Rothschild dynasty. While they thrived on the predictable wars of the 19th century, the world wars of the 20th century were total chaos. They weren't just wars between armies, they were wars against capital. First came the taxes. Governments in Europe introduced massive inheritance taxes to pay for the war machines. When a Rothschild patriarch died, half the fortune was instantly seized by the state. The compounded wealth of a century began to evaporate. Then came the Nazis. This is the chapter of the story often left out of the conspiracy blogs. In 1938, when Hitler annexed Austria, the first thing the SS did was march to the Rothschild Palace in Vienna. They arrested Louis Rothschild. They held him hostage for a year. The ransom? The entire Austrian assets of the family. Steel mills, banks, art collections. The Nazis looted the French Rothschilds too. They seized their palaces to use as headquarters. The family had to flee to New York and London, leaving behind wealth that was never fully recovered. By the time the smoke of World War II cleared, the center of gravity had shifted. Wall Street, led by the Morgans and the Rockefellers, had replaced the City of London. The Rothschilds were still rich, but they were no longer the only game in town. They had become just another boutique investment bank in a sea of sharks. Which brings us to the elephant in the room. The biggest myth of them all. Go to any corner of the internet and you will read that the Rothschilds own the Federal Reserve and that they have a net worth of $500 trillion, more than all the wealth on Earth combined. Is it true? The reality is more nuanced and perhaps more boring than the fiction. The Federal Reserve was created by a secret meeting in 1913, a story I cover in detail in my other video. And yes, Paul Warburg, the architect of the Fed, was close friends with the Rothschilds. But there is no evidence that the family actually owns the U.S. central bank today. As for the $500 trillion, it's a mathematical impossibility. The total wealth of the entire human race is estimated at around $450 trillion. If the Rothschilds had that much, they wouldn't just be bankers. They would be gods. The truth is, the family today is fragmented. There isn't one Rothschild. There are hundreds of them. Some are bankers, yes, but others are environmentalists, scientists, or simply socialites living off trust funds. The shadow government that people fear isn't a single family anymore. It has evolved. It has become a system. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, faceless algorithms that control more money in a day than Nathan Rothschild saw in his entire life. The Rothschilds didn't lose the game. They just finished it. They built the casino, wrote the rules, and then cashed out before the house caught fire. So what is the real lesson of the Rothschild story? It isn't about Illuminati plots or secret societies. It is a lesson about the nature of value itself. Nathan Rothschild didn't win because he was smarter than everyone else. He didn't win because he was luckier. He won because he was faster. In 1815, the speed of information was the speed of a pigeon flying through a storm. That slight edge, that gap between what he knew and what the crowd knew, was worth the entire British Empire. Today, the pigeons are gone. They have been replaced by fiber optic cables laid across the ocean floor, transmitting data at the speed of light. High-frequency trading algorithms now battle for advantages measured in nanoseconds. The tools have changed, but the game remains exactly the same. The market is still a battlefield. The crowd is still prone to panic. And somewhere, in the shadows of the digital exchange, there are still men standing by the pillar, waiting for the signal to sell, ready to turn the fear of the many into the fortune of the few. The Rothschilds showed us that money is not just a store of value. Money is information. And in a world where information is instant, the most dangerous crime is being second. But if the Rothschilds taught us how to accumulate money, the 20th century taught us how to destroy it. How did we go from gold coins that lasted for centuries to paper bills that lose value every single day? Why did the government decide to break the promise that money was worth anything at all? The answer lies in a secret meeting in 1913 and a presidential decree in 1971. And that is exactly what we are going to investigate in the next video. If you want to understand why your savings are melting away, hit that subscribe button. You cannot afford to miss the next chapter. I'll see you there.